This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'm going to begin review of CDFM Module 3, Competency 1, Fiscal Law out of the 2020 study guide. So I wanted to go through the 2020 study guide to ensure that if there are any differences from the older study guides, that I'd be able to capture those at this time. So I'll begin in the 2020 study guide on page 3.1.7, which is the basic idea behind fiscal law. The basic axiom of fiscal law is whatever we do with the appropriations must be directly stated in the appropriation language that we get from Congress. On page 318, it goes into the constitutional authority. You have Article 1, Section 7, 8, and 9. So remember, legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch. So Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. So whenever you see Article 1 of the Constitution, you know that it is directly speaking to the legislative branch or Congress. So it says under Article 1, Section 7, that Congress is allowed to raise revenue and delineates how Congress will pass the bill from their house up to the president. So that's where you find it in Section 7. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to collect taxes, empowers them. And then Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, which is the one that financial managers, if you don't remember none of them, you need to remember this one, because this is the reason the government shuts down if we don't have an appropriation law. Because in the law, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, no money shall be drawn out of the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law or a stopgap, which is what we call the continuing resolution. The GAO, Government Accountability Office, which is an external auditing agency that works directly for Congress. So Congress tells us do's and don'ts of these appropriations, and then the GAO comes behind Congress to check to verify that we are following those rules. So the GAO establishes guidelines for the use of the appropriation. And you can find that in the GAO Principles of Federal Appropriations Law, commonly known as the GAO Red Book. Throughout the study guides, all three together, we'll talk about the GAO Red Book, Yellow Book, and Green Book, which is similar to a stoplight, red, yellow, green. So the Red Book deals with appropriation, the yellow deals with auditing, and the green deals with internal control. So you'll always hear me put those together, even though they're not directly stated on this page. So in the GAO Red Book, with dealing with appropriations, you learn that appropriation have specific purposes and then some that are general in nature, but we cannot indirectly state what we can do with appropriation if it's not directly stated in that direction in that appropriation law. So you have a few laws on page 9 that you need to be familiar with. Budget and Accounting Act. You have the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit. OMB Circular A11. You see it quite continuously. OMB, Office of Management and Budget, is the resource manager at the executive level branch. So that's why we get OMB Circular. So when they give us policies, it's typically published in an OMB circular. So A11 deals with budget formulation, planning, and all of that. So we'll go through those a little bit later. Moving on to page 3.1.11, the sources of authority on the use of public funds. So as you know, when we process funding documents, we have inputters, then we have someone that approves, then we have someone that certifies the use of those funds. And because we are actually spending taxpayers' dollars, we have certain responsibility. We'll either have a fiduciary responsibility or a certifier, which is a pecuniary liability. Fiduciary is typically the individual who says, okay, you have a military construction you want to do, and you're using military construction dollars. Okay, and we have the right funds, correct. fiduciary. Pecuniary now is that certifier that says, yes, we have the right milcon dollars to make this expenditure, and I'm the one that's going to certify to make the payment. So the difference between both is a pecuniary with a P. Remember, F comes before P. Fiduciary comes before P. So the pecuniary one, if we certify funding and it's erroneous, wrong, incorrect, we can be held liable to pay back those funds if we cannot retrieve it through a reversal process. So pecuniary, when you're pecuniary, like a dispersing officer, a certifying officer, a dispersing officer, a deputy dispersing officer, DDO, the ones who actually push the money out, they may be responsible for paying back the government fund if they erroneously make a payment or certify a payment. So remember that. All right, 3.1.12 goes into availability of funds. So whenever we receive appropriations, they all have a specific purpose, specific timeline in which they are available for obligation, and they come for in a specific amount. So if we violate those, we typically say, oh, that's an ADA violation. So what we're going to be looking at is what type of ADA violation have we committed. So 31 U.S. Code, that means it's a law. 31 U.S. Code is the law, and the chapter and section is either chapter 13 or chapter 15. So as you can see on page 3.1.12, purpose is 31 U.S. Code 1301, time is 1502, amount is 1341, 1342, and 1517. Become quite familiar with this chart because it'll help you as you move along in the process. Purpose 1301, amount, purpose time 1502, amount 1341, 1342, 1517. All right, so let's look at purpose. So what it says on page 13, 3.1.13, which is covered in 31 U.S. Code 1301, appropriations shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law. So for whatever that purpose dictates, if we're using MilPers, we're paying military personnel, and whatever it says in that language, or O&M, the except here is mainly referring to O&M dollars, because in some instances we can use O&M dollars to do a construction project, because it says it in the law. We can use O&M dollars to make a procurement if it's under a certain dollar amount. So a purpose, specific timeline. So in the general purposes on page 14, some are general in nature. Used for training, used for travel, books, periodicals, miscellaneous. When we can't figure out what it is, we say miscellaneous. And then on page 15, it goes into specific purpose authority. So within the Authorization Act, remember when we went through the different phases, budget resolution, authorization, and appropriation, within those laws, there's typically restrictions, guidelines that's listed. So we have to look, as financial managers, we're responsible for knowing what each one of those regulations, laws talks about, because there may be some do's and don'ts in those regulations. So it's talking about the sources. You either can find it in the Authorization Act, and remember, authorization authorizes the programs, appropriation gives us the funding. And the CG decision, this is not the commanding general, it is the Comptroller General's decision. And remember, Comptroller General is the title of the individual in charge of the GAO. On page 16, when you talk about purpose, you have to analyze the necessary expense. Do we really need to make this purchase? So there are three things that you have to look at the necessary expense doctrine. Logical relationship. Is what it is that I'm trying to do bear a logical relationship to the type of appropriation I'm trying to use to make that expense? The expenditure must not be prohibited by law. Did Congress say you cannot spend any O&M dollars to do military construction project? You have to check that. And the expenditure must not be otherwise available somewhere else. So meaning I'm not entering in a brand new contract for things that I can get through the supply system. It's already provided in supply system. I just don't want to wait for that process, so I enter into a contract. So if either one of those, it's saying that you don't need it using that appropriation. So purpose, 31 U.S. Code 1301. Time begins on page 3117. 31 U.S. Code 1502. It says, verbatim, the balance of a fixed term appropriation is available only for payment of expenses properly incurred during the period of availability or to complete contracts properly made within that period. So a timeline, every appropriation has a specific purpose, specific timeline that they're good for our new obligations, such as MILPERS and O&M 1 year, RDT&Es a 2-year appropriation, procurement 3-year, military construction and shipbuilding conversion Navy are both 5-year appropriations that they're good for spending, new contracts. So appropriations controlled by time. And when you look at time on page 18, you're looking at the bona fide need. Current year need using current year dollars. That's the basic theme behind it. Is if I need something for the new fiscal year, I cannot order it in May. Typically, if you're at the end of the fiscal year and there's something that you need, the service that starts early October, you may begin the contracting process, but you cannot use your current appropriation to do something for the new fiscal year. So when you're looking at time, on page 3119, you have to consider your service contracts, your different types of contracts. Your contracts can either be severable or non-severable. Severable meaning if I end the contract, I would have still received a benefit out of that contract. And the best example of a severable contract is a cleaning contract. So we have a company that comes in every week, they clean, take out the trash, dust, whatever it is that we have for them to do. They come in and they do that. But let's say mid-year, the government no longer needs that contract. We can end the contract, but we still would have received a benefit in the past. Whereas a non-severable contract is one where once we enter into that contract, we have to complete the whole process to receive a benefit. I want to renovate a building. I cannot sever that contract and actually renovate the building. That means something is going to be left undone. Training. When you go to a training, you typically have specific things that you have to learn to get the complete benefit of that training. So training is considered a severable contract. Now, when it comes to obligation, there's a couple of rules that you have to be familiar with. Severable contracts, 12 months or less. So let's say it's August, September, and I'm entering into a severable contract that has a period of performance that starts September 30th and it goes for 12 months. Even though it's at the end of the fiscal year, for a severable service, you will obligate the full amount of the contract using current year funds. See, now that's different than what we said, bona fide need, current year requirements using current year funds. But an exception to the rule is severable contract, 12 months or less, you will obligate the full amount of the contract regardless of crossing fiscal year. If you have a severable contract that is more than 12 months, let's say it's a 13-month contract, you will still obligate the 12 months using current appropriation, but you will have to then subject to availability of funds for that new fiscal year for that 13th month. So the rule is 12 months or less, obligate the full amount of the contract using current funds. For a non-severable service, regardless of how much it is and when you do it, if the period of performance begins in, let's say, fiscal year 21, then you will pay for that full amount of that contract because it's a one-time undertaking, basically. It's not like a continuous contract. So non-severable service is that 1 year that you will go ahead and obligate the full amount. Permissible action on page 20, I typically point this out because most of us are familiar with the term subject to availability of funds, which is the second paragraph. Not too many people are familiar with the first paragraph because, yes, there are instances where the government has already appropriated the new fiscal year funding prior to that new fiscal year beginning. And within the Department of Defense, there's a few years, I think 2018 or 19, somewhere up in there, we actually, DOD, had our funding in September for the new fiscal year. So what this is saying is if that happens before 1 October of that new fiscal year and you have the new fiscal, you can begin entering into contracts citing that new appropriation because it's already been approved. So that's what that first paragraph is talking about. If the Appropriation Act is enacted prior to the start of the fiscal year for which the appropriation is being made, meaning if I'm going into FY22 and come September I have FY22 approved appropriation, then I can begin entering into contracts using that for the new fiscal year. All right, page 3121 talks about termination of contracts. So it's either by convenience of the government, and it's typically written in the contract when the KO writes the contract, contracting officer, it is written that if for the convenience of the government no longer needs your service, that the government can get out of that contract with no issues. The other one is a contractor default. So we hired a contractor to do a particular job, XYZ, and you have contracting officer representative that's supposed to annotate, verify that the job is being done. And let's say halfway through it that the COR determined that the individual contractor is not getting the job done. They've been working with the KO. Then they have to fire that contractor, but I still have the requirement. The job still needs to get done. So what happens is the KO has to then notify that contractor, fire them in essence, and then they have to pay them for. So as a COR, you have to ensure that when you're certifying that job, that it is actually certified to do what it is that that performance work statement said they were supposed to do. Because once you certify it and say it's correct, then the government is obligated to pay that contractor for the work they completed up to that point. Then whatever funding we have left, then that KO can try to get another contractor to do the job. Or if it requires, sometimes you go after a contractor and you have to repeat the whole process, is that requirement may have to go back to the approving officials to request additional funding because it may have to change the scope of what was already approved to fix what that other contractor did to get you to the point you need to get to. So those are some things that you have to consider. On page 22, it talks about the life cycles of your appropriations or appropriation life. So you have appropriations that are single year, annual, multi-year, 2 year, 3 year, more than 1 year, or no year. They have no expiration date, but there are still restrictions, and those are your X year, X-ray, XYZ. So no year appropriations, which is typically your working capital funds, those funds that continuously operate throughout the year. Good chart on page 23 to show you the top appropriations that the DoD deals with, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what they're used for and the typical, either the expense type or investment type appropriation. And on page 24, they go briefly into the no year, which is 31 U.S. Code 1555. For life cycle, does not expire, but they still have restrictions laid out by Congress in how they are to report. The goal of the no year appropriation or the working capital fund is to break even. So nowhere in the government should we be trying to earn a profit. So what you need to know about working capital fund is no year, doesn't expire. However, the goal is to break even. So that means whatever that individual is charging, for instance, the commissary is a working capital fund. So initially when they establish or set up, they receive appropriated funds to begin. Once they start, they take those appropriated funds, buy the items, put them on the shelf. Then based on what it costs them to put the items on the shelf, they put a price on the item, on the food, on the milk, on the juice, and so forth in the commissary. And then they charge the customer. The customer comes in, buys the item, and that money is then revolved back into the process. Now, the next year, if the commissary looks at their prior year and determine, okay, we charge too much because it looks like we're making a profit, then the commissary is required to lower their prices on that certain items, to lower to the intention is for them to break even. So they have to lower the prices. So that's why in 1 year you might see something at one price and you go back the next year and they're either lower or higher, because part of that no year requirement is for them to adjust the prices so that they can break even and not continuously appear to be making a profit off the customers. On the bottom of page 3125, with the life cycle, every appropriation goes through 3 phases. They're either current, meaning they're available for new obligations, expired, and closed. So what you have to know here is what occurs in each one of these phases. 1, you need to know what's the appropriation you're using. If I say I'm using RDT&E funding, then the phase 1 is 2 years. That there's RDT&E, research, development, technology, and equipment that is good for new obligation, phase 1. Phase 2, every appropriation is expired. So even though, let's say we use O&M dollars in fiscal year last year, once that new year begins, that 1 year appropriation or 2 year appropriation enters into a 5-year expired state. So what can you do with these funds in the expired state? The only thing we can do is make adjustments to things that have already been obligated. We can make upward or downward adjustments. We cannot enter into any new contracts using expired funds. So at any given time as a financial manager, you're not only dealing with current execution, you're dealing with these expired accounts that haven't zeroed out, they haven't paid out, they either haven't dispersed or they have balances still left on them. So we're still processing accounts in the expired years. And then phase 3, at the end of the 5th year, entering the 6th year after the expired, every account is closed or canceled. Now, there's some restriction. When they're closed or canceled, those funds are returned to the Treasury and placed in the miscellaneous receipts account. And the only thing we can do with funding in the closed state, so if a bill comes in, an invoice comes in, and that account was closed, you can use up to 1% of current appropriations to pay that closed account. Does that make sense? So the funding may be closed, but the requirement is still there. That person, that business, you may still owe them money. So if it's not a whole lot and you have it in your current appropriation, the same type, you can use up to 1%. If not, they have to work with DFAS to get paid. So all of what I discussed, even though I'm just looking on page 3125, but it's actually in the textbook, it goes all the way to 312627 at the top of 27. All of that dealing with time, 31 U.S. Code 1502. And finally, we enter the amount part of fiscal law, purpose, time, and amount, which is covered in 31 U.S. Code 1341, 1342, and 1517. So we're going to look at each one, and based on the verbiage, it'll tell you who it addresses. So let's go to page 3128. So the first one is 31 U.S. Code 1341. It says an officer or an employee of the government may not make or authorize expenditure or obligation exceeding the appropriation. So we can't spend no more than what we have in appropriation, and we cannot spend in advance. We can't spend it before we get the appropriation. So 1341. There are different forms of budget authority on page 29. Budget authority is where we get the go ahead, the right to obligate these funds. You can either get it through the appropriations law, where it tells you what you can use it for, contract authority, then you have borrowing authority, offsetting receipts, loan, and loan receipts. So those are your different budget authority, which you probably should know those. So I usually put them in ABCLO. ABCLO. Appropriations, borrowing authority, contract authority, loan and loan guarantee, and offsetting guarantee and offsetting. Yes. All right. Concept of earmarks. So when Congress earmarks these funds, again, guidelines, they place ceilings saying you can't spend no more than $5 million to do this, or floors. If they want to make sure you spend funding on certain things in the DoD, they'll give you a floor. They say you could spend no less than $5 million. Or fences for a specific purpose. You can only use these funds for this purpose. The second one is 31 U.S. Code 1342. It deals with voluntary services. Can the government accept individuals coming in and just volunteer to give free service to help offset manpower? For instance, if you have a spouse, they're not working, their background is financial management, but they want to come into your office and they want to sit next to the GS-12 and just learn and watch what they do. Is that allowed? So that's what we're looking at here in 31 U.S. Code 1342. Can I violate this particular amount? If it states, and if exceptions to the laws, the interpreter is saying, if that job, that position can be placed at zero, that means I have the right to say, okay, there's no pay for this particular position, then I can accept voluntary services. However, if that position, if I have it's a GS position, it's a contractor position, whatever it is, and it's detailed by law what that position is, and there's a pay associated with that position, then I cannot accept voluntary services. You can accept voluntary services for organizations that already have the right to for statutory or gratuitous services. And the example they give, like the Red Cross volunteers. By law, they are allowed to volunteer their services to help museum volunteers, candy stripers, and all of those. So they already have statutory authority to provide free gratuitous services. 31 U.S. Code 1517 on page 3132 deals with apportionment. So you have appropriation, apportionment, allotment. So before I go over this one, I'm going to jump to page 33, the funding flow, and talk about these terms. Appropriation comes from Congress. So what I'm writing in my book next to appropriation is Congress. Apportionment, who apportions? OMB apportions funds down to the Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Energy and Water, and all of those. So OMB apportions funds. DOD and the other agencies issue allotment. So I'm putting DOD issues allotment. And then all the subordinates who get the allotment, we commit, obligate, and we outlay funds. Outlay is replacing the word for us, disbursement. You're not going to see disbursement in the study guide. Outlay is what happens when the funds are removed from the Treasury, which is basically the same thing as disbursement, but outlay is the official term. When the funds are removed from the Treasury to pay for a bill, it's the outlay. So remember, OMB apportions. So when you go back to 32, so OMB apportions to the agencies. So page 32, apportionment, 31 U.S. Code 1517 says an officer or an employee of the United States government may not make or authorize an expenditure obligation exceeding an apportionment. Well, at most of our levels, we do not get the apportionment, so we cannot violate 1517. Who can violate 1517? The agencies, Department of Defense. So up at that level, they can violate 31 U.S. Code 1517. So for the most of us, we can violate, 1341. Yeah, 1341, when it trickles down. But the bottom line is apportionments happens at OMB apportions funds to the Department of Defense, and then DOD issues allotments to the rest of us. So that's your funding flow. And it states there at the bottom, Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, and the agencies issues allotment. In some instances on page 34, an agency has the authority. Remember when I said that once an appropriation is closed or canceled, those funds are returned to the miscellaneous receipts in the Treasury? Well, look at page 34, that first bullet. Under 31 U.S. Code 3301, the miscellaneous receipts statute. So that is the law that says why the funding goes back to the miscellaneous receipts in the Treasury. All right, so switching gears on page 35, it talks about gifts and donations. Can we accept gifts and donations? And this does not go into as much detail as in Module 1. If you look on the bottom, the last paragraph, gifts to employee, they are referencing you back to Module 1, Competency 2, because it goes into more detail. But the bottom line you will find there in Module 1 is that gifts to employees, there's a $10 limit on the amount that an employee should donate to a superior gift. It doesn't really talk about, if you look at the stipulation, it doesn't really talk about a superior donating a gift to a subordinate, limiting to $10. It talks about a junior. And if my supervisor is leaving and they're coming around asking for a donation, I do not have to give, or I am limited to $10 or less to donate towards that gift. Penalties. So if an individual on page 36 violates those ADA, those 31 U.S. Code, 1301, 1502, 1341, 1342, and 1517, and some of the other ones, because those are not the only anti-deficiency laws out there. There are various penalties. For administrative penalties, it could simply be removing that individual, you retrain, or you can remove them from that position, that job, suspension. But there are criminal penalties, up to $5,000 fine, 2 years imprisonment, or both, that they can receive. So in our job, we cannot say that we didn't know. Ignorance is not an excuse of the law. So if it's blatant that Let's say it's a construction project and it was supposed to be construction dollars, and we decide we were going to use O&M dollars instead, and it's a $5 million project and we use O&M dollars. Yeah, we made a mistake. Maybe we didn't know, but it's not an excuse for being relieved of the pecuniary liability. We have to pay those funds back or get fired if it cannot be corrected. Because in most cases, we can reverse a transaction, we can get it fixed, but not in all cases. ADA relief in most cases, in view of the explicit provisions of 31 U.S. Code, it has been held that there's no private right or action for declaratory, mandatory, or injunctive relief. So that means just because I made a mistake, there's no right to say, well, it was just a pencil, fat finger mistake. I put an extra zero or whatever it is that the error is. There's no direct relief. You still got to be investigated. So criteria for recording obligation on page 39, basically what that is saying is we cannot obligate funds unless we have a legal obligating document. I have a contract. I have a military interdepartmental agreement. I have a MIPR. I have loans. I have order. Whatever it is, we cannot just go in and obligate the funds. We have to have an obligating document. So recording principles. Commitment of a fund is simply setting aside. Like, let's say I have $20 in my pocket and I say I'm going to go out to lunch. So I've committed the $20 to go to lunch. I haven't gone to lunch, so I still got my $20. Obligation is legally binding the government. And what that looks like is that $20 I have for me to go to lunch, I go to lunch, I order the food, I receive the food, I say, yep, looks good, I eat the food. Now I'm obligated, because I accepted the food, I am obligated to pay for the food that I have consumed. So obligation is legally binding that debt, binding you to that debt. So recording principles. Now, recording principles is looking at, let's say you have a contract that has stipulations on it, meaning if the contractor gets a job done early, they get a bonus payment, or if they don't get a bonus, then you get a discount if you pay your bill early, or different things. So recording principles, it have to be an internal business rule that you have to determine, am I going to obligate just the base amount of the contract? And then if they earn the bonus, then I pull the bonus out, or do I obligate the full amount and the bonus to set the money aside, committed to ensure that the funding is there when I need it? Or do I know that I have enough additional funding that even if they do earn it, I can get it? So those are recording principles, are your internal business rules. Continuing resolution 3141. So remember, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, if I don't have an appropriation law in place, then the government will shut down because I cannot remove any money from the Treasury. So continuing resolution is a temporary appropriations law that we use in the government to ensure that the government doesn't shut down. It's a temporary stopgap. It's a Band-Aid. We are restricted. No new contracts when you are under a CR. I can only operate under the same level of operation as prior year. So if I only spent $5 million in the prior year, I can now come the same time frame this year, and now I'm spending $10 million, or I want to spend $10 million. Then they're red flags. So you're restricted to same rate of operation as prior year with no new contracts. Can't start nothing new. So rate cannot exceed the current rate. So all of that covered from 41 through 44 talks about your rate. And And on 44, it talks about, okay, so once I'm operating under the CR, under the rules of the CR, and I want to ensure that no new contracts, but I'm still operating, then Congress comes back and they give us less. So it says the rate of operation exceeds final appropriation. And the question becomes, well, did I commit an ADA violation? No, as long as you were operating under the CR rules. And then Congress appropriates the money, but they gave you less. So now you have to adjust fire on what you have, what you received. You have not exceeded, nor have you committed an ADA violation based on those rules. Sequestration is where they automatically hold federal funding to do certain things. And so that's listed on 45. And then government shutdown is mentioned on 46, which again, now you know the reason. And let's see if it tells you. Delay in enactment of the bipartisan sign by President Trump. Enacted budget signed into law actually resulted in a 9-hour funding gap. However, it occurred during the night and did not result in non-essential DoD employees being recruited. Okay, so if you read 46, it'll tell you the different years in which we actually had an appropriation before the fiscal year began. All right, so accountable individuals. So it gives you a list. It has departmental accountable officials certifying, dispersing. So these are the individuals that have pecuniary liability. They're pecuniary certifiers. So they can be held liable if you're in one of those positions, as most of us are, especially when you deploy, you become a dispersing agent or dispersing officer. And that means if we lose any funding, we are held liable to make those payments. So we have to be very careful in how we spend those funds. Illegal improper payments, you look at the duties and responsibilities, the functions of the certifier, reporting requirements, factors that do not affect a mistake. Remember, I said that a few pages back. Inadvertently, I made a mistake. It's a minor violation. It doesn't matter. Even like when you're a dispersing officer, they used to tell us, even if you're over in your cash register $1, then we're like, okay, then that means you didn't do something right. You're not supposed to be over. That means you took money from somebody else or something was done incorrectly. So there's I could say zero tolerance. You almost have to be perfect, even though nothing is perfect in our job. We have to be very close to perfect. And when you're not sure about making an expenditure on page 49, you can ask for advance decision. So whoever your hire is, you can ask, hey, I need to make this payment. I need to do this contract. I need to make sure I'm using the right funds. Can you help me figure that out? And then they can do that. Relief. Can you receive relief of accountable individuals? So he talks about physical loss. That means you actually have cash. You're deployed. You have physical cash with you, and you lose those cash. The Secretary of Defense determines that the official was carrying out official duties. So it's saying that you make the Comptroller General, that's the individual in charge of GAO, may grant relief if it shows that you were doing your job. You were out, you were on a convoy with the money, you got attacked, the money got lost when the loss occurred. So you made for a physical loss. The loss was not the result of nothing that you did illegally. They couldn't prove, because you're still going to be investigated, whether you were attacked or not, whether you were wounded or not, we still get investigated. So the loss was not the result of anything illegal, criminal, off fault, or negligence. Illegal, incorrect, or improper payment. Payment was not the result of a bad faith. So pretty much you can kind of see the consensus here is the relief only comes if you did everything right, but Murphy's Law showed up and things still went awry and you lost funding. Statute of Limitation. 3 years from the time if it's an error, just a basic error, then it's 3 years, your statute of limitation from the time the CG receives the account. For fraud, there is no statute of limitation. So if fraud was committed and you are a financial manager, dispersing officer, or accountable official, you're anywhere in that process and your name is signed on any of those documents, whether deployed or stateside, if it's fraud is involved, there's no time limit associated with that statute of limitation. So you got to keep that in mind as you approve things. Make sure we cannot say, well, the legal folks or the JAG or the lawyer said that, hey, it was right for me to use my O&M dollars for a $5 million military construction project. The responsibility is not on the legal folks. We basically have to be our own ethical lawyers to make sure that we're using the right appropriation to do the right thing. So it ends with, on page 51, the basic axiom of fiscal law being the same is that I cannot buy something, do something with appropriation that is not directly stated by Congress that I can do it. And especially if it's already prohibited by Congress, I cannot make those expenditures. All right, so the next few pages is a bunch of definitions and terms that we discussed that you should be familiar with. So let me see if there's anything that we didn't discuss. Appropriation, authorization, budget authority. So we covered all of these. Budgetary accounting, contract. So on page 3153, so I wanted to make sure I went through this new study guide to ensure that we don't miss anything. The Feed and Forage Act, although I couldn't find it anywhere else in the study guide as I went through it, but it's mentioned here, and it was in the older study guides. 41 U.S. Code 6301 is the Feed and Forage Act. Yes, you need to know it, because what it does, it allows the Department of Defense, if they're in some type of deployed location or in a situation where the DOD has to make expenses, have to purchase medical, they need transportation, they need a place to stay, any one of those stipulations, hospital supplies, that gives the 41 U.S. Code allows the DOD to spend more than what they have. So you go back to all the other laws and U.S. Code, under normal situations, we are restricted to spend what we have when we get it. But under the 41 U.S. Code, if it's a situation where, like you say, food, clothing, and you're in an environment, let's say you're in a cold environment, your soldiers are freezing, you don't have enough gear, you have to buy the gear, then you may have to spend more, obligate the government. You don't have the physical money, so you're obligating the government. You get the stronger, thicker coats for your personnel. Then under citing 41 U.S. Code 6301, the DOD is allowed to spend more under these conditions. So I wanted to point that out to you because I don't think it's covered anywhere else. At least I didn't see it. All right, so you can actually review the other topics and definitions that's listed there. And this concludes the fiscal law. It's a lot of information, and it covers the majority in Module 1, Module 2, and Module 3. This fiscal law accounts for the majority of the questions. So ensure that you review the material again and that you look in Module 1 and Module 2 to see if anything, because sometimes you'll have a topic in one, like the working capital fund in this section was 1 page. If you go to Module 1 and Module 2, you might have additional pages that talk about working capital funds, just to give you a better understanding of what they mean. So be sure to click like. If you like the video, click like, share it with other individuals that seeking to achieve their CDFM certification, Certified Defense Financial Manager certification. And then be sure to stop by again next time as we go through the rest of CDFM Module 3. out of the 2020 study guide. So thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys again next time. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group.